Hello, everybody. We're entering into a phase of the course where we're going to talk a little bit more about social media. Actually, we're going to talk a lot more about environmental social media. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that topic. We've already touched on some uses, particularly use of Twitter as a platform, but I want to go a little bit deeper than that. So this short lecture should get into that a little bit. First things first, I want to explain what we mean by social media and how it differs from traditional media. So you think about traditional media, uh, mass media is things like print, broadcasts, and internet. And really, when we think about traditional mass media, we're thinking about newspapers, we're talking about um, uh, mainstream television and radio, and not even really cable, but that's something, all of that has come on much more recently. And so that's mass media. Peer-to-peer communications typically are things like mail or fax, or even just use of the telephone. So that's equal nodes, one person conveying information to another, that person conveying information back, typically. What makes social media interesting and unique is that it combines elements of both of these very different communication styles. And so it opens up a lot of opportunities, but it also presents quite a few challenges. And when it comes to environmental communication, I think it's fairly unique. And so we'll be discussing that in more detail. Now, in order to use social media in environmental communication, there are a few things that need to be addressed. One is the functionality of the platform, of various platforms, and how that functionality can be used in communication. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But the other thing that I think is really important to start off with is audience. Um, Unlike traditional forms of media in the past, mass media in particular, for instance, the radio or even broadcast television, that was sort of beamed into everyone's home. Uh, Social media tends to have much more a niche appeal to particular demographics. And I think understanding that is really critical as you seek to communicate with others, or as we seek to communicate generally about the environment. We've already sort of spoken a little bit about messaging and how knowing your audience is so very important for getting a message across. And so I think understanding how different groups of people use different social media platforms in different ways is very important. So I want to talk about that first. So I'm going to show you a series of graphs from Pew, the Pew Research Center. Pew has been doing research on social media use for quite a long time, I think as early as 2005. And that has increased over time and getting increasingly more sophisticated. So first thing I want to point out is that social media use has grown fairly rapidly and fairly extensively over the last 2 decades, to the point that in February of 2021, about 72% of US adults said that they use at least one social media platform. Now, I want to point out that all the data that I'm going to show you is from 2021. 2022 data is still, I think, not quite processed. But you can imagine that none of these trends seem to be going downward. So most folks are using social media. The majority of Americans, US adults, are using social media, so we can understand the importance of social media as a communication pathway. And we can break that down a little bit further, and we start to see some very interesting patterns. Well, first of all, as you might expect, younger people, 18 to 29, increase use of social media most quickly. Their uptake increased most rapidly. But in recent years, that has plateaued. And so I think that's a pretty interesting point to make. And in fact, you might even see that there's a little bit of a downturn with some folks beginning to reject social media for many of the, because of many of the social issues that use of social media has caused. As case in point, you've probably heard of a recent lawsuit by many school districts suing social media platforms for their impact on young people. One of the things that I think is really interesting in looking at this data is you probably noticed that 65 plus folks, older folks, senior citizens, they were much slower to take up social media, but we see that they are an increasing demographic, increasing users, and that's twofold. One is that they're starting to pick it up, but also, as you might imagine, as folks get older, those folks who were in their middle ages and early adopters are now getting older, becoming senior citizens, and they're just naturally more savvy with social media platforms, but increasing demographic there. Across different race and ethnicities that are tracked, we see relatively similar use of social media platforms, although there are differences in the types of social media platforms that different racial groups tend to use more than others. But white, Black, Hispanic, those are the three broad categories that are tracked by Pew. We don't have, unfortunately, we don't have detailed information about a lot of other race and ethnic groups, at least not on the broad scale of the US population. Interesting trend in gender identity tends to be that folks who identify as women, female, do have a higher social media use than those folks who identify as men, and that has been a fairly constant theme, since the late, I think since around 2010, but it's increased a little bit over time. So women use social media more than men. And then a pretty interesting trend also in terms of education level. Folks who are more highly educated tend to use social media more frequently than more frequently than those folks who are less educated. And so you can make of that what you will, but one thing that I want to point out here, and I'll continue to point this out throughout, is that you can imagine how some of these patterns in demography play out in terms of not only who's using the platform, but who's receiving the messages that are being sent on those platforms, who is participating in that aspect of the public sphere. And certainly age is a major factor, but also education, another major factor. Now we can get into this even further, and we can look at the types of platforms that are being used. And here's just a smattering of some of the most popular over time. I think a couple of really interesting things to point out is, of course, that Facebook has a very, very large share of in terms of social media use. And I mean, as you can pretty clearly see there, some others that are interesting. Obviously, YouTube is another one that is used frequently. I want to point out that, of course, YouTube has been around longer than 2018, but that's I think the earliest that Pew was keeping records. So Facebook and YouTube are very prominent social media platforms. A couple others that are interesting, for instance, TikTok, and is one that's relatively recently on the scene, and it's being used more and more frequently. So some general trends there in increasing use and who's using what. Now, another interesting point to consider is how frequently people are using these sites. So people are using at least one social networking site, but how often are they using it? We see that for a lot of U.S. adults, they're using these social networks, these social media sites, platforms, on a daily basis. About 50% or more are using them daily. And so that's a really important, I think it's a really important consideration about the frequency of use. Now, this is also seen by many as one of the big problems with social media. It's sort of the dependency that people seem to have on particular social networks and on social media in general. Now, I do think it's important to point out, I just showed you the Pew Center data, which was explicitly about US adults. And I think that a couple of points. One is that we have less information about people under the age of 18, although there are some disturbing trends and sort of abuse of social media, which is, of course, why there's been this outcry to and backlash towards social media companies. But if we expand out beyond the United States, we see that there's a lot of other stuff going on out there. Now, of course, Facebook and YouTube are the most popular social networking sites worldwide, but you notice that some social networking sites that we here in the United States think of as being fairly common or fairly important are not very popular worldwide. So, there's some differences across international boundaries as to which social media platforms are more popular than others. Okay. And again, I'm showing you this because I do think it's important to think about the audience for any particular social media platform, and who's using it, because that would impact the kinds of content, the kinds of messages that might be transmitted on those platforms. All right, the next piece I want to talk about is sort of the functionality of social media platforms, because not all social media platforms are created equally. They tend to focus on particular functionality, particular attributes. And so I want to walk through some of those. And I don't really want you to think too much about what you're seeing on the right. Don't worry about the implications of that functionality. I really just want you to think about the honeycomb of social media functionality that Keatsman laid out. And as you can see, there are sort of 7 fairly discrete functionalities. I want to walk through those in the following slides because they are really important for considering how we might use social media for environmental communication. Those are, presence. It's essentially users knowing when other users are online and where they are at. Relationships, that's the extent to which users relate to each other. Reputation, that's the extent to which users can develop social standing amongst their peer group, amongst others on the platform. There's, of course, identity in the middle. That's essentially the extent to which users reveal themselves. Is this anonymous, or do we know a lot about the individuals themselves? There are groups. That's the extent to which users are ordered into communities and sort of develop in-group structures. There are conversations. That's the extent to which users communicate with each other. So there's some two-way communication amongst folks within the platform. And then, of course, sharing, which is the extent to which users exchange, distribute, or receive content. And some platforms do this much better than others. So I want you to think about those 7 functionalities because they are really, really important. And it's critical to understand that not all platforms do all of these things or do all of these things as well as each other. So moving on from that, I just want to provide some examples of these various functionalities. So for instance, presence, the extent to which users know if others are available. Some platforms do this fairly explicitly. Think about, for instance, on Facebook, when you can check in at a place. And so you, as logging into Facebook, you can see when folks you know have checked in to a location. And the interesting thing about the check-in feature is that we see this being used more with increasing frequency when there are disasters or other issues. So we see people checking in that they are safe when there's a wildfire or a hurricane or a flood. So you can see the relationship to environmental communication in that instance. Similarly, with Facebook Messenger, there'll be a green indicator when your friends are actually online and you can communicate directly with them, which can actually increase the rate of conversation as well. Speaking of conversations, platforms like Reddit they really sort of focus on conversation. People can put up whatever content they want. Pardon all the expletives here, but this is an example of a conversation on Reddit about, and this is sort of under our environment, conversation about the IPCC report and about climate change. Groups, groups, that's the extent to which users are ordered or form communities. A very common example a very common example here. You may recognize this this platform. I used to think this one was really just simply for folks who wanted to complain about their neighbors, but there are some advantages here of being able to order yourself within your local neighborhood or community, particularly if you if you want to know about environmental issues in your neighborhood. So I think Nextdoor has some downsides, but also if you really want to link presence within your community to the group of individuals that you most closely reside near, it's a useful one. Just thinking sort of outside the box. Sharing. There are multiple platforms where sharing and exchanging, distributing content is very important. And of course, we have the rise of content creators and influencers. Here's an example on TikTok, for instance. TikTok is really focused primarily around sharing content, and this particular example of environmental TikTok. And there's quite a few creators that are making content specifically about the environment. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in terms of functionality, and Keatsman, I think, does a good job of describing this, is that for any of these platforms, although they may be focusing on one attribute, that might be their clear bread and butter, if you will, most platforms really do actually accentuate multiple functions or functionalities simultaneously. So for instance, in Keatsman, there's a pretty clear example of YouTube, which is primarily about sharing content, but there are some other attributes as well. Similarly, in this case, Facebook might be all about relationships. I can go into a little bit more detail about that. For instance, here is YouTube, and a great example of a YouTube content creator and influencer who focuses on environmental topics, in this case, zero waste. And so it's just some clear examples. This particular creator is sharing content that is explicitly about the environment and about sustainability, and creating content, as you can see from the various videos down below. Within the content section for this creator, there are, within those comments, there's a lot of conversation going on about the topics that she is discussing, and people are sharing their opinions as well. So although sharing is the primary functionality, conversations are also occurring. That's sort of a secondary functionality. Similarly, as this creator creates more videos about this topic, her reputation as someone who knows about sustainability increases. And so we don't learn necessarily a whole lot about her as a person, but her reputation as someone who knows about addressing waste issues certainly improves or increases. And similarly, because the content on the site is explicitly about sustainability and zero waste, as you can see here, the fans of this site, the community of this site, actually do form an ordered group discussing and sharing information about zero waste sustainability. So just to drive home the point that although sharing is the primary functionality of the platform, in this particular instance, we can see how functionalities, reputation, conversations, and group are also being accentuated. Similarly, we can look at a site or a social media platform like LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn is really interesting because, of course, one of the things you can do is link up with others within a professional social network and form relationships with them. And as you can see here, you can have first order connections. You can have secondary or tertiary connections with other people. That might be considered the primary function of LinkedIn. But of course, you can also build your reputation within LinkedIn by adding content to your online resume, as well as getting endorsements or recommendations from other folks. And because you're sharing so much about your identity through your resume, your CV, your background, you are revealing information about your identity that allows people to understand more about who you are, that connects identity and reputation. Now, one thing I want to point out is that social media platforms do tend to change over time. They change with regular updates, and the landscape of social media is relatively fluid. These companies are primarily, of course, out to create profits. And so they are constantly tweaking their platforms, accentuating different functionalities to differentiate them from their competitors. And so I've highlighted presence and conversation here because at one point, LinkedIn did focus a little bit more attention on those particular functions. They do less of that now. And in fact, I would say they spend more effort in other areas by changing the functionality of the platform. So for instance, now groups tend to be accentuated within LinkedIn. You can join, for instance, an alumni group at your university, or you can join an interest group around environmental sustainability. And so you can then order or form a community around a topic with like-minded individuals. Similarly, LinkedIn has made it much easier to share content. And so we've seen recently, for instance, somewhat of a migration of people. It's not very common, but there is a little bit of a migration of people moving from Twitter to LinkedIn because of the recent change in ownership at Twitter and some of the more controversial things that have gone on recently. And of course, we've talked about, I've just been talking about the functionality of some of the more common social media or social networks out there, but there are a lot of others as well. This was an interesting story that I read back in 2020, because even dating sites are dipping a toe into environmental communication. In this case, OkCupid was allowing people to filter by their beliefs, their affinities towards environmental topics as well. In this case, I think you could identify people or filter out people who did not, or people who might be considered climate deniers, for instance. So that's just an example of how different social media platforms are structured so that certain functions or functionalities are accentuated and are more useful for different things than others. Now, one thing I'd like to mention as I transition now is one point about this idea that you could go on OkCupid and filter out people who might be climate change deniers if you're someone who is passionate about the subject of environmental protection. That might be good if you're looking for a date, but that's not necessarily good if you're trying to expand your ideas about things or engage with other people around topics that might be considered controversial or uncomfortable. Okay, which gets into my last points for today, which are about some of the challenges of social media when it comes to environmental communication. There are a couple that I want to just touch on very, very briefly. First is the idea of echo chambers, and you can see how it's sort of a talking about OkCupid is all fun and sort of lighthearted, but you can see how you can develop echo chambers on social media sites because you are engaging with like-minded people. And if you're engaging with like-minded people and avoiding uncomfortable or controversial topics or avoiding people that you do not agree with, then you are only reaffirming the things that you already believe and that you already appreciate and agree with. And so in this case, this cartoon, you've put the social media blinders on and you're not experiencing any divergent viewpoints. And there's been a certain amount of research on this topic. This is an interesting work that was done exploring Twitter use. This is a paper from 2017 that looked at a controversy around banning the sale of beef in India. And what you're looking at here are tweets and retweets of the hashtag beef ban that had very different sentiments. People with opposing viewpoints are indicated in red and blue here. And the point that the researchers are making from this graphic is that if you look at retweets as linkages between the nodes, you'll notice that folks with one viewpoint in red are retweeting other people in red. People with the other viewpoint in blue are only retweeting others, or really, I should say, mainly retweeting others with that same viewpoint. There are not that many cross linkages here. Most linkages are occurring within those groups. So you can imagine what's actually happening here is the formation of echo chambers where similar information that reaffirms the viewpoints of the within group opinion or idea or way of thinking are being reinforced. And you can see from these larger nodes that some opinions are being shared and some information is being shared much more frequently than others within groups. And much of that information is not being shared across groups or retweeted across groups. So this is what we see as sort of the formation of an echo chamber around a controversial idea. And as I guess an additional challenge that actually stems from these echo chambers is sort of the spread of misinformation, which we see on social media platforms pretty extensively. We've seen this over the years. Of course, you've all probably heard about misinformation that was spread during the 2016 campaign for US president, but we see it pretty widely around environmental topics as well, including climate change. I think that this cartoon is a great illustration about how misinformation can be spread. And the linkage between echo chambers and misinformation is actually quite tight. There's been quite a bit of research on that topic, and this work by Ruiz and Nilsson, I think, is quite interesting. This diagram is great for demonstrating how misinformation can spread very easily within an echo chamber, because echo chambers tend to focus like-minded people around what we might call identity-driven culture war topics, right? So in the case of a deceitful attempt to spread misinformation, that information can be seeded. In the case of something deceitful, that could be seeded within an echo chamber, and the controversy around that topic can be accentuated, which drives it deeper into the echo chamber, because you're not sharing controversial topics with people who have divergent points of views. That allows individuals within those echo chambers to fine-tune their argumentation, their arguments in favor of their own points of view, which are then reinforced by people within that same echo chamber. That also enhances what we call adversarial narratives, us versus them. Things you wouldn't necessarily say to your neighbor in person, you can say online. And what happens then is that we get more into identity politics and identity-driven culture wars, and less about the logical arguments around those topics or issues. For instance, climate change becomes less about the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more about liberal versus conservative and the ideals of those groups. Last challenge that I want to mention very briefly, and one that comes up in our reading as well, is this idea of clicktivism, or some folks actually call it slacktivism. I think this cartoon, I think, sums it up very nicely. The point of clicktivism is that social media and social networking sites have allowed us to engage in performative activities around the environment in a way that's very easy and doesn't require us to put ourselves out there. It doesn't require us to truly engage with the topic or sacrifice in any way. And I think I would really love to hear your thoughts on this topic of collectivism. Just food for thought. We consider, for instance, that back in 1970, the first Earth Day, and how important that was. Now, Earth Day is back then was all about protest. It was all about getting together with others and sharing thoughts and ideas about the environment. Those protests, which were a million-strong protests back in the early 70s, they led to the formation of the EPA, the passage of the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. It's, for me, hard to imagine how collectivism might achieve those same ends. So just something to think about as we move forward with this topic. That concludes my discussion of environmental social media. I look forward to chatting with you more about this in class as well for our discussion and our activity this week. Thank you.